The Zero RB blueprint for 2025. That is what we're going to talk about today on RotoViz Overtime. We're going to look at it through the best ball landscape and how things are setting up in the ADP space as we move forward here and try and take down some huge tournaments ahead of the start of the NFL season. Shawn, I had the good fortune of having a conversation last week for the RotoViz Fantasy Football Show with Peter Overzet, and we went through some of his favorite Zero RB targets. I'm going to be interested to see where maybe we have some crossover here today and some of the discussion that we have around the landscape in general, what might have changed and where you might need to, zig or zag in 2025 here. So I'm looking forward to talking with the man himself about Zero RB. That is the one, the only Shawn Siegele. As we kick off today's show, I do also want to mention that we had Shawn's big gorilla piece published on rotoviz.com over the course of the last week. We did hype it up last week on the show, and I had a lot of people, Shawn, they were itching, they were ready to read it, and they were excited to get, to visualize it. So it took a few days longer to make sure everything was in the appropriate place, but happy to say it is up on rotoviz.com and lots of positive feedback about it, over 12,000 words. So I would highly recommend, if you are drafting, to use that as a piece beside you if you're doing your draft to pick the best players and to set the teams up in the best way. The other thing I want to mention is we did just cross slightly, a couple hours before we started recording here today, Shawn, crossed 4,000 over on the YouTube side for 4,000 subscribers. So that was a pretty fun landmark to hit. But Shawn, another day closer to the start of the NFL season and the perfect time of the year to talk about Zero RB.
Well, Colm, any time of the year is a good time to talk about Zero RB. But I do want to note my thanks to everybody on the big gorilla article there. After getting Colm's feedback that people were asking about it, I asked Blair to sort of stay up late on Thursday night and do a big edit so that I could do some more editing on Friday. We could put it up on Friday as opposed to go into the weekend with it not up yet. Between the two of us, I mean, he and I probably spent 10 hours alone just like in the editing. Now, there are probably still errors in it, right? And that's kind of the way it works with something of that length. So when you hear...
sometime it has to go to print, Shawn.
It does have to go to print, right? If you hear 10 hours of editing and think there are still mistakes in this, I mean, I apologize for those, obviously, too. But it was a big effort with multiple people, and I appreciate everyone involved in that process. It was certainly the biggest sort of single article project that I have embarked upon in, say, like the last 15 years of writing about fantasy. And I'm sure that there are also mistakes, obviously, in terms of the recommendations, how that will turn out. That's just the way that works as well. But I am pretty excited about the overall product and do think it will help drafters. So, Colm, we hope that we'll be able to keep up a good run ourselves, you and I. We have had the good fortune. I do always want to emphasize good fortune, too, because these things can come back against you. But you and I were able to take our main event team in 2023 into the playoffs, our main event team in 2024 into the playoffs. In 2023, we did finish in the money. In 2024, we just missed. And so, I mean, obviously, you and I are looking for a top 10 finish. We're looking for the overall championship, that $1 million. But to have advanced in consecutive seasons, Colm, we may have won the regular season once and won the postseason once in terms of the individual league. So, or something like that at the very least. So excited to do another one of those with you this upcoming season. Colm, the other thing then that this kind of leads into for this question of 2025 and Zero RB is that I do think that other approaches are very viable this year. One of the most fun elements currently is that the combination of running back talent and running back ADP, there was a full decade where going robust running back not only would have not been like a good recommendation, it would have been flagrantly ridiculous, right? And there were so many ways to break it down and show that you were really flying against the numbers if you went that route. I think you could go that route this year, but that's not what today's show is about. today we're going to look at zero RB, which Colm, that means a couple of different things, right? It means you've got to have the wide receivers that you want early. It's easy to focus on, well, these are zero RB candidates. You can get these guys late. Some of them are going to break out. They're going to make your team work. But before we get to the zero RB candidates and who you can draft at that position to make the running back portion of it work, you have to have wide receivers that you want to draft early.
Yeah, and the thing you had on there was this year does feel like there's a lot of ways that you could go through your drafts, a lot of different scenarios. We've talked, and we'll talk a little bit probably today with the elite quarterbacks and how that might fit builds. Obviously, the elite tight ends, and on the RotoViz Fantasy Football show over the last few weeks, Pat Corinne was on. We talked the quarterback side, talked a lot of it then with Pete last week. And to give a plug for this week, JJ Zachariason will be on to talk some rookies this upcoming week. But the landscape is quite interesting with how drafters have shaped up the ADP. Where players are going feels appropriate for quite a number of different positions, even those veteran running backs and where they tend to be going. It's very interestingly set up. So the landscape is intriguing to do it a number of different ways. We're looking into zero RB today, and the reason we've dived into it today, there's a number of topics and suggestions that have been sent by the listeners over the last couple of days and weeks. This one came in through YouTube from Brobean, and he asked the question about, can we get a video about zero RB roster construction for 2025, when to push for more wide receivers, and if this is the year to snag an elite quarterback instead of elite tight end in a zero RB build. So we're going to go through the construction. We're going to go through maybe some of our targets as well. But Shawn, the part here, I guess, to kick us off, maybe we'll go into that part of the elite quarterback versus the elite tight end in the zero RB build, because historically, elite tight end is obviously a key part to the strategy itself. Where do you come down on that potential question from an elite tight end versus an elite quarterback? Or maybe is it a case that you get an elite tight end and consider an elite QB in some of those builds?
The elite tight ends are so important in the FFPC format. And I mean, this is one of the things right now that I think is so much fun, is that we have a couple of big formats that really are quite different. And those differences add sort of a joyful wrinkle to fantasy drafting this time of the season, because you really do want to approach them differently, at least in some targeted ways. And one is the tight end, where in FFPC, it's almost the key to everything you're doing. And some other formats that minimize the value of the tight end, those of us who like to draft tight ends have to at least keep ourselves somewhat in check and say, look, this may not be the right way to do it. Try and calm yourself and avoid what seems like this great value on tight ends that come up every round. Right. The thing that is interesting about this contrast between best ball and redraft, and Colm, we're doing a little bit of a best ball show today. Obviously, lots of people are playing best ball, and we haven't done quite as much best ball content recently with some of the focus that we've given to Dynasty, that we've given to the early redraft contests out there. You can attack these onesie positions through weight of numbers in best ball in a way that is more difficult to accomplish in redraft. Now, that's not to say that you want to ignore those positions early, or that addressing it through numbers is as good or better than getting the stars. But it is possible. And one of the things that constantly shows up in the roster construction explorer is that it's not just the early tight end, but a lot of tight ends is the key. And it can be difficult to force yourself, even if you like the tight ends, to draft as many as will work. And some of our folks who just year after year after year dominate the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, the Superflex Tournament, they tend to be drafters who certainly layer in some stars, but also just draft a lot of tight ends. And one of the things that I really do want to focus on with this idea of the star tight end is it's not just that you're drafting one super early. As is always the case in fantasy, you want to get the highest scoring ones. And I think that was one of the things that was lost a little bit last year, is that you had some guys early who were arguably overdrafted. Now, we love Sam Laporta. One of the reasons that our dynasty teams are in good shape is that we drafted Sam Laporta in the second round of almost every draft a couple of years ago. The rookie drafts there. We have a lot of Trey McBride. Those two guys as a foundation was obviously very favorable, but then you're looking at last season and you're saying, despite the fact that he's a rookie, Brock Bowers is the guy who, when you're talking about the size of the hit for the cost, is going to crush everything. Now, you're not always right on that, but I want to emphasize the fact that it's not just the first guy. And last year when he came through, we said Sam Laporta is looking at a lot of contextual issues when it comes to meeting what he's being asked to do ADP-wise. Meanwhile, Brock Bowers is not. And so it's not just drafting the earliest one. You've got to draft the highest impact player. And I do think that one of the guys who could be that this year would be a Green Bay Packer, right? You're looking at Tucker Kraft there at tight end 14 early in the 9th round. I wrote about him at some length in the Big Gorilla article. So again, so much of the stuff in that article is more or less, format agnostic as well, and that it'll give you targets for anything that you are currently pursuing. I don't think that Tucker Kraft is going to be a hit to the extent of Brock Bowers by any stretch, right? But when we're thinking about the impact of a player at the price, he's probably someone that you need to be very, very aware of. And it's great for you that he's inexpensive, because it does then allow you to do some other things. Similarly at QB, when we're thinking about this combination of just getting to pick the highest scorer from our roster every week and getting that combination in concert with the stacking benefits that you're going to get in best ball, there's going to be a lot of value to simply making sure that your drafts are set up to get 2 or 3 of these guys who can really deliver sort of outsized returns and can do it while providing these additional benefits. Had a big piece on that last year and how you were likely to run into some problems with the elite QBs, and specifically guys like Josh Allen, guys like Jalen Hurts. Those players very sort of minimally underperformed last year. Obviously, they still had good seasons. They have high scoring profiles. They're probably not going to kill you, right? We want to think through what they're likely to do versus, say, a Jaden Daniels a year ago. And who would the QB versions of those guys be? Especially at QB, for me, Colm, it's always trying to figure out who that player is, because we have, on the one hand, I do think that drafting the early QB, despite what you give up, is actually just taking the safe path. But you're also going to look back and think there are a lot of QBs who are viable late in a way that most of the other players late simply are not viable at all. So you have more floor. And then when you hit on the guy who comes out of nowhere, and then you say comes out of nowhere, but in many cases, this arrival or breakout was signposted in so many different ways. It was like a breakout that came out of everywhere, right? If you have that player on your team, it's going to be difficult if you use the early pick and you paid for the early pick to compete with that type of player. I think it's a lot of fun to have both paths be very viable, both, I think, globally, but certainly in 2025. And we'll talk about some different ways to get there in a moment, specific types of paths. But Colm, is that how you are seeing this as well? Just to throw a name out there as we get started here, I've become more and more fascinated with the price and the upside that Bryce Young offers. In redraft, he's completely free. And the problem is that in redraft, you've got to decide who to start every week, and you're not going to get maybe as much benefit from some of those types of things. But even in best ball, we were talking about QB 25 in round 13.
Yeah, so what it really comes down to here is the players, in that 1v1 scenario. So like, is it a case that you take Jaden Daniels or Rashee Rice, and then, a player I'd be looking in the kind of range a little bit ahead of Bryce Young would be like a CJ Stroud or a Jordan Love, and you're kind of looking then at, Michael Pittman or Darnell Mooney as the wide receiver options, and kind of the tier breaks of what, basically what you're saying is you can potentially draft 2 to 3 quarterbacks in the quarterback window that might give you the weekly production of some of the elite guys, but it's unlikely you're going to draft a wide receiver in that range. It's going to give you the firepower of some of those early wide receivers, and that's kind of how I would be seeing it. The interesting thing with the QBs, and particularly Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jaylen Daniels, and even like if you look at Jalen Hurts and Joe Burrow, when we look at where they're going in the FFPC, for example, in the 3-4 range, I think the decision that people are kind of finding their way leaning towards that is the third and fourth this year is more veteran heavy with wide receivers, the likes of like Mike Evans, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Terry McLaurin, that you may be like DJ Moore's in there too. And then it has some younger players that haven't fully answered some questions yet, like Garrett Wilson, Marvin Harrison, to go along with it. So when we look at those, I think people are maybe going the way you mentioned for the safer potential option. But I do still think that particularly the Russian QB profiles, Lamar Jackson and Jayden Daniels and how they've performed versus some of the other quarterbacks are intriguing there. But I think the quarterback window, what's interesting about it this year, and that's for people who maybe haven't heard us talking about before, is that range usually between kind of 9 and 12, but this year it's kind of going from 8 down through 12. And the reason for that is a lot of the QBs, Shawn, are either going in that 3-4 range that I mentioned. You have Patrick Mahomes in 6, and then you pretty much have all the other quarterbacks going in that zone outside of the guys that are sprinkled through the later rounds. So the QB drafting situation this year is quite interesting with how it is set up. I also think that the elite tight end stuff that you had on is going to be a key piece this year. I think some people got a little bit burned maybe last year by dipping their toes into the elite tight end drafting, and maybe they didn't like it as much if it didn't work out, depending on who they selected. But you mentioned Sam Laporta, and I do think like he's a 4th round pick in the FFPC side of things. George Kittle's in the 3rd, and I think both of them are quite a bit undervalued with where they are going. You mentioned the situation for Laporta last year coming in and how high he was being drafted, but his numbers across the season still trend very well, even though he came in, coming off the back of the injury from the year prior. He was a tight end 62% of the time last year, even working his way back from that injury. And post the bye week for them in week 11, he had 2 games where he's a wide or tight end 2, but the rest of the time, then the other 5 weeks out of the 7 was a tight end 1. So I think he still is someone who really fits into that category of the elite tight end. But as we move into the big question, Shawn, looking at the wide receiver position and then the running backs that go with it, I do think the running backs, previously looking through the dead zone and how things would have set up, I do think people are probably evaluating running backs both in the opening rounds and then as we work through it much, much better than previous years. People understanding the profiles and where they're setting up by ADP. And that also means that the rookies are a little bit more expensive. Then it makes it a little bit tempting for some of the veterans who are maybe going in the 8-9 range. How are you feeling about the market pricing so far on running back ADP and how that sets up the profile here for the 0 RB builds? Because there is, some of the guys here, these rookies in particular, in the 3 through 5 range. You have Chase Brown in there, Kenneth Walker. There's a lot of names in there that are also interesting. How are you feeling about the market prices here for running back in general?
We look at last season, and one of the interesting things there is that we did have this wide receiver class that was extremely dynamic, especially at the top, but had, in retrospect, 6 guys who look like they're going to be stars. And in some ways, the player who was taken at the top of that in Marvin Harrison may be the player who's the riskiest, has the most weaknesses when we think about this group going forward. Certainly the other kind of big name there, Rome Odunze, would also be in the risky mix when you have names like Neighbors and Thomas and Worthy and McConkey who look very, very good at this point. When we think about last season, in the rookie mix was very skewed to the wide receivers. It was a sort of singularly weak, in some ways, rookie running back class, even with the big hit that we end up getting from a Bucky Irving. Despite all of that, but despite the new talent coming in at receiver, we had ADP that was very skewed to the receivers, very wide receiver heavy at the top. You have this season, which was essentially 2016 all over again, where you have the veteran running backs stay healthy, score a lot of points. In the first half of the season, especially, it looked like, okay, this is going to be the massive running back rebound. And then things sort of fall apart over the second half. You do start to have a few injuries. You have some guys fall off slightly. When you think about Alvin Kamara and Joe Mixon, who were a big part of the early going, they don't make as much of an impact down the stretch. You do obviously have this fantastic season from Saquon Barkley carrying through. You have the massive breakout from Jahmyr Gibbs carrying all the way through. You have a very nice season from Bijan carrying all the way through. And partly what we were missing last year was Christian McCaffrey being able to stay healthy and provide points, and the Miami Dolphins continuing to provide a good environment for Achane. In a different show, we'll probably talk about how Achane and one of these guys who, it is early in the second round. It's not like he's that inexpensive, but I don't think it would be a surprise if he ends up delivering top 5 production as opposed to, say, 1-2 turn type of production there this year. My broad point, which I'm taking a while getting to here, is that even with a lot of things in terms of the player pool being very favorable for receivers, because we had this running back pricing, and then because we had relatively good running back health, it was a very good season to have drafted running backs early, at least in contrast to history, where, again, going running back heavy has just been crushing for you in best ball. Now we go into a season where we continue to have great information out there on how wide receiver early is the dominant form of best ball over time. Certainly people understanding how it's really a matter of stacking these elite receivers with QBs that create dominant best ball lineups. You have the second half of last year where zero RB-ish teams really clawed their way back and still were a big part of the second half of the year and the race for tournaments, that type of thing. And you have that then carry over into this season where things have just taken sort of a seismic move in the opposite direction, where we have a very weak wide receiver class and we have a historically good running back class. And so what that means is that we probably have a somewhat weak pool of wide receivers in these early rounds, and we have probably the most loaded running back group in the early rounds ever. With that being the case, Colm, it still sets up that if you want to pursue, and one of these things too is you think about that, and there have been a variety of other seasons. It did look like 2023 might be the year where things kind of switched, right? Where moving to running back early would work. And then essentially what we saw instead was you have running back injuries, you have all these great wide receiver performances, you have the ability to get zero RB outcomes, and the right build, historically dominant build, still wins. It could easily be the case that the dominant build across the last 15 years will be the dominant build again this year. And there are definitely paths to building a great team that uses that. How do we do that? What's our first step here as we go through these early rounds?
So when we kick it off, and we're going to give more of a broad overview rather than a round by round, player by player conversation here. But the interesting thing you mentioned there, Shawn, about the player pool potentially being weak in those early rounds, I think the wide receiver options through, I'll go as far as wide receiver 11. You could go wide receiver 12. You could go wide receiver 13, 14 if you want, depending if you want to put JSN or Garrett Wilson into that, or T. Higgins if you want to move AJ Brown in or out of it. But I think that those opening 10 wide receivers through the opening 2 rounds may be as strong as we've probably ever seen through that particular range. I think there's very few question marks or red flags with that particular cohort. And once you go past that tier break, and as much as I like T. Higgins and JSN and Garrett Wilson, I think that's where the break for me happens. But then you get into, Tyreek Hill, Terry McLaurin, Marvin Harrison, as I mentioned. You get down into DJ Moore, Xavier Worthy, moving into the 5th round with Ted McMillan, Devontae Smith, Travis Hunter, Zay Flowers, DK Metcalf, Cortland Sutton. You start to get into more and more question marks very, very quick. And there's a lot of player profiles in there that I think that I'll be bypassing quite a bit this season. So that sets you up with situations where we're talking about Brock Bowers and Trey McBride in the 1st round, or those, high-end running backs, the likes of a Jamar Gibbs or an Ashton Jeanty or Bijan Robinson or Saquon Barkley. But it makes the picture very, very hard to draft any of those running backs, because I think you're going to need that 1st round and 2nd round wide receiver firepower in the majority of the teams when you get to the end of the season and see how things land up, because the question marks do get bigger and bigger as we work our way through. And that also means that in some of these rounds, looking at wide receiver, you may only have 1 to 2 out of those 12 picks that are available of actual genuine targets that you want to have on your roster. And that's where I think it makes it a little bit challenging as you work your way through those opening 6 rounds as to which of those names that you want to slot in. I think, Shawn, in some of those, there will be reasons where you take detours or maybe take a running back in that range to supplement the rest of the roster. But do you feel similar to me? Like, I'm looking here at round 6, and you have Jerry Jeudy at one side of the round, and you have Jameson Williams at the other side. And between that, then the wide receivers are Chris Godwin, Robert Dunze, Jalen Waddle, George Pickens. I feel like in that round, like, I'm looking at Jerry Jeudy and Jameson Williams, and in between that, then I'm like, if they go off the board in the first 2 picks that round, and I'm picking at the 11th spot, I'm like, well, I'm probably going to have to look at a receiver in the rounds beyond that, like a Jordan Addison. I think there's a little bit of a slimmer path to some of the wide receiver targets maybe that we will have versus what we maybe had in previous years, based on how the ADP is setting up the rounds. Would you agree with that?
Perhaps. And one of the things that I do think sometimes happens is that, well, I say sometimes happens. Our approach tends to be a pretty targeted approach where we're really looking for the types of profiles that we know can beat ADP by multiple rounds. Yeah. There are a lot of different ways to sort of discuss this idea of upside. For me, the clearest way to express it is always, are you drafting a profile where if things go right, and we're not talking about like a 95th percentile outcome, but just if the normal, fairly straightforward parts of the thesis hit, you don't need anything extraordinary to come along. But if the player plays to your expectations, they're going to jump several rounds, then drafting that type of player is fairly straightforward. Jameson Williams, a guy who would pretty easily fit that, although, I mean, we'll see how this Detroit offense evolves. But you're going to continue to run into some issues where if David Montgomery is a part of it, and that was the thing that was so interesting about that very fleeting moment last year where he was hurt. When he was out, like, this offense is an all-time great offense. This offense now has enough plays to get the ball to Gibbs, to get the ball to Amon-Ra, to get the ball to Jameson Williams, to get the ball to Sam Laporta, to score basically every possession, to score from any spot on the field, and to not burn all this time and to create all of these drives that might fail with the David Montgomery. Maybe they'll learn a little something from that, but probably they're going to continue to create bad down and distance situations on some of their drives. They're going to continue to soak some of these plays out on some of their drives, some of their games. That makes it tough, right? So maybe if he hits, he still doesn't even rise that much, because it's going to be the same thing that we always talk about with Sam Laporta. Like, how early can you draft someone who is going to just face this problem every single year? as you go forward. It's certainly the question with Jahmyr Gibbs. And a lot of people are like, okay, well, I'm hearing people say fade Jahmyr Gibbs at the 105, and yet at the same time, I'm kind of interested in Gibbs at the 101. But I mean, the 105 shows that Gibbs is being faded because otherwise he would simply be the top player picked, right? Gibbs is basically this combination of Bijan Robinson and Saquon Barkley. If he weren't playing in Detroit, he would be going 101. Jerry Jeudy, somewhat straightforward. I mean, he's the guy who probably should just be going in round 4 already. Colm, one of the things interesting there is it's so different, the situation with the Browns versus this situation with, say, the Colts or the Saints, where the Saints have maybe the least talent at QB any team has ever had. And it'll be very difficult for them to find someone who can get the ball to Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed. The Colts situation, I'm kind of coming around on a little bit because I do think that you have this setup where probably Anthony Richardson takes a meaningful step forward and is still bad, but isn't so apocalyptically bad that nothing else on the offense functions for either reality or fantasy. Or you get this move to a Daniel Jones, where I think people are probably a little bit lower on Daniel Jones than his actual performance indicates. But certainly there are things where, would that work for Jonathan Taylor and getting him enough receptions to jump into the middle of round 1 in value? Probably. Would it work for a Josh Downs to get him that Wan'Dale Robinson role, but with more dynamism? Probably. There are ways that could work out for some of their guys. The situation in Cleveland is they have 4 guys who probably are okay. Now, they're not going to, in all likelihood, make the playoffs. Certainly, they're not going to be a Super Bowl contender with that group. But out of those 4 solid players, whoever wins should actually be like solid plus. Now, maybe it's one of the rookies as you're dealing with all of the rookie developmental time period as you go through. Maybe they continually switch every week, but even like switching every week with guys who were not competent. Jerry Jeudy had a bunch of huge games down the stretch. Now, he had the one kind of devastating game for us that was the down game. But even then, he comes back the next week and has like a career high in targets. When you think about some of those elements that we've just talked about, I'm looking here at, say, the 109. Now, you're not going to necessarily get these guys available to you in every single draft. Obviously, it's not the way that it works. But right now, ADP would tell you that if you have the 109, you can start with Malik Neighbors. He's probably not that far behind Jamar Chase for me as the top receiver on my board. You have Malik Neighbors, you come back in the 2nd round and you draft Nico Collins. You come back in the 3rd round and you go ahead and take that risk on Tyreek Hill. And suddenly you're thinking to yourself, I mean, I may have just drafted the top 3 receivers in all of fantasy football. I'm certainly set up with a high ceiling here. You come back in round 4 and you take Xavier Worthy. You come back in round 5 and you're kind of hoping that one of the rookies in McMillan or Hunter will fall to you. But if they don't, you can select Zay Flowers. You could certainly reach for Jameson Williams if you want to. You come back in 6 and you say, take Jerry Jeudy. And now we have 6 receivers. We would probably stop there for our full roster. We have 6 receivers, all of whom have very strong profiles for their draft slots. And now we can kind of look to the rest of the draft to fulfill all of the rest of the goals and objectives that we obviously still have to accomplish.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But the part there that when you're doing this that we can do is like we can name out the players in those rounds, Shawn, that we like, and we can take them. But what I'm saying about this kind of potentially thin path at times is where they're gone. And I think that's where you get into the situation where we're quite comfortable doing it, whereas I don't know if other drafters would be, where, you know, if you're in a situation even at the late 3rd, you know, Worthy has a kind of mid to late 4th ADP, we would be happy to take him there. Or Jerry Jeudy, who you mentioned, could potentially be a player that we may even consider in the 4th round, for example. We'd be pulling them up. But it might be a case this year where you're doing that if those other particular players that we're going to have as primary targets are not available or are selected just before us. Shawn, the key part, and I'm sure a lot of people who have clicked on to watch today and they're thinking, who are the targets? Who are the guys that the guys are looking for? So you mentioned through round 6, looking to load up on those wide receivers, even enter round 7, You could get some potential other options. You may also have your elite tight end at that point, so it may leave you one wide receiver less. I do think there's a very interesting range of wide receivers then when you get beyond round 11. You mentioned Josh Downs or the Colts situation, but Emeka Egbuka, Luther Burden, you start to get into like Jaden Higgins, some interesting profiles, I think, in that kind of 11 through 15 range that could be intriguing to add on to the roster if you had less wide receivers at that point. But Shawn, when we get into round 7, still not a huge amount of the running backs I'm looking to get there. I do think I would be trying to add another wide receiver in that range with DeAndre Swift, Tony Pollard, Aaron Jones. When we get into round 8, I know you're a big fan of Cam Skattebo, Jaylen Warren's in there. And then we kind of move down further. You get into, like, I think there's a little bit of a flat spot here when you're trying to think of that start of the quarterback window. I think this is a pocket where the QBs, some of the secondary tight ends become quite interesting. But then you get Tootin in the 10th, you get Jaden Blue in the 11th. But again, I think that these may be players that I'm saying, it's a little bit flat in the 8th or the 9th. But, if you want to have those guys on your roster, the like of a Tootin, you may have to, just take him in the 9th. The only running back going in the 9th round at the moment is Tyrone Tracy. How are you feeling about the zero RB, I guess, quote unquote, zero RB rounds? And then hit me with a couple of your priority targets here. We won't give away the whole 15 from the zero RB list. Obviously, that'll be coming out later in the summer, but give us some of your favorite guys.
Yeah, well, you mentioned Jaylen Warren. I've kind of moved the rankings for Warren and Johnson to where they're almost identical. I felt, and I guess in some ways I still do feel that Warren probably should be maybe gapped up a little bit. There's such a big difference between where Harris was drafted and what that means in terms of the role that just gets anchored in for him over time versus where Caleb Johnson was drafted. Now, this is one of those elements where I do think we have to continually sort of make it at least small. We don't want to overdo it and make massive mental adjustments based on the strength of the class and just start saying, well, everybody in this draft we should look at as a second round pick. I mean, that would be overdoing the adjustment. But when we think about where he went, maybe you move him up a little bit in your mind. Certainly there are some very strong positives to his profile, but there are also elements to his profile that are probably a little bit overstated. There is some risk that he's just simply not nearly as good as Jaylen Warren. Warren's someone who in 2023, top evasion rate in all of football. You could make the argument that he was the best running back in the entire NFL in 2023. I probably wouldn't go that far, but there are certainly plenty of things in his profile that suggest he would be in the conversation. Injuries in the first half of 2024, comes back in the second half of 2024, and again looks better than Najee Harris. Both of them good peripherals. The difference with Warren is he can actually generate yardage off of that. You have a 3-down workload. You have someone who, again, if you like this Steelers rushing offense, and I think that's the part for me as well that is perhaps overvalued, but if you like the Steelers rushing offense, Warren shouldn't be available in the mid-8. Obviously, you mentioned Skattebo. One of the things that is interesting here about best ball, and one of the biggest difference in terms of thinking about how you're going to be able to construct these best ball teams versus the redraft teams, is just that all of these QBs being drafted to get to the 2 QBs that you want, the 2 QBs in the window, what have you, means that running backs are being pushed down. Now, the flip side of that is you have to take 2 QBs yourself. So maybe it doesn't make that much difference to you unless you're comfortable doing what I was talking about, or what you talked about, where you're talking to a CJ Stroud, Jordan Love. You have maybe a second QB in that Penix, McCarthy, Ward, Young range, or you used the early pick at QB, and so you really are targeting your second pick in the Young range, which would free you up for additional picks at running back in the traditional QB window. So if you're freed up there, it's great to see someone like Tootin early in 10 as opposed to being like early in 9. He's someone who is obviously going to be very interesting there in Jacksonville. I think Jordan Mason, someone who probably should be getting a little bit of that Jaylen Warren treatment in Minnesota. And you can look at that from the perspective of, okay, well, Jaylen Warren is probably undervalued, but Jordan Mason is still much cheaper and is dealing with a veteran at the very end versus a rookie who is just drafted, maybe the dynamic taking over type of player. And we would also actually expect Minnesota's running back overall environment to be better, right? The Vikings are going to score a lot more points. They're going to be on the fast track there inside in Minnesota. You could end up having a lot of touchdowns for them. You could have Mason not really scampering, but breaking through for all of these rumbling, 20, 30, 40-yard runs. So he's someone, obviously, who would be quite interesting there. Colm, Jaylen Blue, keep going back and forth on him because his pure rushing profile is very weak. And yet you think about what works. And Ben and I had what I thought was a really fun show. I've been working through a lot of things for an article to see how much of what we talked about I can back up with some SIS numbers, with numbers from our tools, the Weekly Explorer, all those types of things, looking at how running back scoring is evolving and where we see that in terms of reality football, all of those types of elements. But certainly someone who has the plus speed. And I want to continue to harp on this element of there are differences at the high-end speed level as well, right? We tend to think of, okay, a guy is fast or slow, and you have one of these dynamic players. It's very different than having someone who runs a 4.5, someone who runs a 4.6. But one of the lessons of Chris Johnson, beyond simply that Chris Johnson was very good and that good players are something that you want to have, but when you start to get into the 4.2 level of speed, when you do have openings, you can take it the whole way, right? When you think about Saquon Barkley, like his yardage was frequently limited last year by the fact that he hit the end zone, or else you'll have another 100 yards at the end of that run, right? However far you can run before you just have to sit down and take a break. Chris Johnson, the same type of way. His rushes are being limited by the fact that you're hitting the end zone at some point. Jaylen Blue, actually incredible combine times. And yet was like, no, I tweaked my groin or whatever he tweaked. He's like, I wasn't running my best. Goes back at his pro day and runs in the 4.2s. Again, you're talking about if there's a hole, you're going to be gone. And that is a very difference-making type of speed, even for little guys, right? We tend to think all the time, there's so much out there about, well, how athletic is this guy for his size? I'm not saying that doesn't matter. But what also matters is that when you have someone like Jaylen Blue, when you have someone like Brashard Smith, if the runway is there, they're going to be able to take it in a way that someone who is fast for being 220 probably still won't be able to do, right? So we look at some of those things. Colm, you sent me a little piece from Twitter that you had found talking about Jarquez Hunter, how good he is. I kind of go back and forth on that one as I work through all of the different pieces. One of the recent shows when Ben and I were talking about who was going to be this year is Bucky Irving. I said, well, it's going to be Jarquez Hunter. I have 4 or 5 guys that I think might be in that mix. And on any given day, I'm like, well, maybe Jarquez Hunter is falling down to the 4th or 5th spot in my list of who that guy is going to be. And then I see the note from you. It's a huge problem from Kyron Williams and Blake Corum that Jarquez Hunter is going to be the most talented back on that roster. I don't think we want to exclusively take rookies. That's one of the reasons guys like Warren and Mason are pretty appealing. You can get deeper, and I think that even though Ray Davis has some question marks on his background, the situation there in Buffalo is so exciting that if you had a James Cook go down, you're just going to get massive points from Ray Davis. There's really almost no other way that plays out if you have a James Cook injury. You have both of these Jets backs. I'm kind of thinking that Isaiah Davis is probably the way to play it. I mean, talk about Braylon Allen is basically already free, but you continue to get less expensive. You have some other things you can do, even in the rounds 14, 15, 16 area. Other guys you can pick, you can get onto that roster. So we have some opportunities to get young veterans in there and then mix in a lot of rookies. Zero RB for 2025, baby.
Yeah, there's lots of options. I think it's going to be intriguing. And one of the things that we'll talk about in other shows is, building the roster from back to front. I think finding those pockets where you want to move in a particular way in 2025 is a key way to start that. We will have lots and lots and lots and lots of more zero RB talk throughout the course of the off season. What I would recommend for people listening, if there is any areas that we talked about today or didn't talk about today that you would like to hear in future shows, let us know. You can send it my way on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. You can email it at rotovizradio@gmail.com, or you can let us know in the YouTube comments. We will be doing a little bit of a mailbag show later this week where we dive into some of those questions and comments. And this show today was suggested by one of those comments as well. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check him out on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.